Welcome home, brave heroes and tarnished alike. I am Ash. This is Ash Quest, and it's been a while since I talked about Elden Ring, the board game. But don't let this video scare you away if you haven't played the monumentally challenging From Software source material video game version of this, because I fully trust that Steamforged Games, who successfully launched and saw their goal met in a Kickstarter campaign several months ago now, are going to deliver an experience that is fully for dungeon crawler board game fans. And players of the game need not have played the video game to appreciate this for what it is. Perhaps that you will appreciate it more if you have played the video game, just because you'll catch references. You'll already know some of the characters on some level. You'll have your own favorites. You'll have your own play style from the video game that you'll attempt to kind of role play out in the board game. That sort of thing absolutely is a given. But if you haven't played the video game, I am more than certain this will be a very good interpretation of this gameplay experience in board game form for you. So let us read the update number 26, which actually came out quite a few days ago as of the time of the recording of this video. Something that I had to think on a little bit, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue tracking all of the updates and sharing them, especially since the campaign is over. But you can late pledge, and I'll put a link below where you can click the late pledge button and continue to get this game if you so desire. It's going to be massive, but for those of you on the fence, update number 26 covers some things that I think are very important to the core experience of the gameplay itself and the gameplay sessions and how they respect your time. And I really wanted to highlight this in particular because to me, it shows that the developers once again care about respecting your time in particular. And that's something that I think a lot of folks could pay more attention to. Either you are homebrewing something or sharing something that is mainly homebrew based for a board game system like HeroQuest, which I commonly talk about on this channel, or if you are trying to get together a project yourself and you are wanting to create something, a new IP that you wish to commercialize at some point in the future. So let's go over these updates, these gameplay modes, and talk about the concept of respecting the player's time just a bit. I'll be very happy if you can join me on this, and let me know in the comments below if you also have invested in Elden Ring, the board game, which for me was quite a hefty cost. But I have full faith it'll be worth it when it comes here. So let's continue. This is going to be basically a wall of text. I'll segue here and there, I think, go off on tangents and rants from time to time. But greetings Tarnished, and welcome to this month's update. They say coyly, as if we've been getting consistent monthly updates. Over the last few updates, I've spent some time going over some of the more zoomed in additions and changes that have been made to the game as it's proceeded through development. In this update, I'm going to cover the different types of scenarios and quests and what you can expect to find within them. I have no photos to share for this one, so brace yourselves for some walls of text. And so this will be your image that will represent. This will be what your eyes look at while I read you this text. Unless you just want to shut the video off, maybe just listen to it while you're driving. Scenario types are now a thing. So scenarios are split up into 4 different archetypes. They could have just said types, each presenting a different game experience for the players as they progress through their campaign. There will be exploration scenarios, boss scenarios, dungeon scenarios, and narrative scenarios. There are also going to be quest types, so we'll get into all of that as well. I thought that this was awesome, and I can't say it any better than the author of this update can, this being Alex from Steamforged. So continuing where I left off, exploration scenarios represent the players exploring the open world by placing hexagonal tiles revealing a map of the surrounding area. While doing so, you'll encounter hardships, regular combats using the grid found in the quest books, resource gathering, merchants, and NPCs. Non-player characters. Essentially, the bulk of what was seen during the demo while the Kickstarter campaign was live is what's found in an exploration scenario. The main thing of note here is that bosses aren't faced in exploration encounters. We'll move on to why that's the case now. Boss scenarios represent the showdown combats using miniatures on grid-based arenas. In the demo, this boss fight was faced at the end of the group exploring, but following a lot of discussion and further testing, we made the decision to separate the two. The crux of this decision is something that's been at the forefront of our minds throughout the development of the game, which is respecting the player's time. There it is. There's the point that I wanted to make about this particular blog Prior to this separation, it was possible to spend an hour exploring, uncovering a boss fight, then spend another 30 minutes fighting the boss only to die to it and have to start the whole thing again, which frankly I'm not sure there are many groups that would be particularly enamored to do. We looked at inserting some sort of checkpointing system in, much like the Sites of Grace often found immediately before boss fights in the source material, and pretty quickly came to the conclusion that we were overcomplicating the solution which was staring us in the face. Separating exploration and boss scenarios gave us the checkpointing we wanted without having to add any additional rules, while also offering groups more flexibility with where they want to put a pause on a play session, making it nice and convenient to pick up where they left off. So you could sort of compartmentalize this in your mind as being a site of grace, which is the checkpoint basically in the video game, the bonfire system if you've played Dark Souls, the video game. It seems like they are probably cognizant of feedback given over the Dark Souls board games and how players can waste a ton of time trying to get through an exceedingly difficult scenario only to come face to face with the boss and, despite their best strategies, lose to the boss and then have to start all the way back at the beginning of the scenario. And that is a great takeaway to have, to make sure that these two experiences are separated if that was going to be the consequence of losing. So having other design options, I'm sure, at hand, this was the route that they chose to go. Let us continue and see what else they are making changes to. Dungeon scenarios represent, well, unsurprisingly, they represent dungeons. Dungeon scenarios task you with taking on a gauntlet of combat encounters on grid-based arenas one after the other, back to back, often culminating in a boss fight. Not much else to say here, nice and simple. Just keep fighting until everything is defeated and enjoy the spoils once it is. Just a segue, break in here. Not really a segue, more of just a break. I don't like how they describe this. I'm not jumping on this immediately after reading it. I did give this some thought over the past week. Dungeon scenarios are different in the video game, and while I'm perfectly well aware that this is not the video game, that this is a board game, it is still a representation in some form, and it's not going to be a one-to-one because that's not practical. But design decisions can definitely be made to accommodate those people who see the dungeon scenarios in the video game for what they are, which is not just back-to-back combat encounters that would greatly cheapen the experience, but rather a combination of combat, treasure hunting, and puzzle solving. There are many puzzles and many secrets in the dungeons throughout the world of Elden Ring. So to have this reduced to a gauntlet of combat encounters and then a boss feels like sort of the easy way out. I hope that Steamforged Games can reconsider the dungeon scenarios path, and maybe they're early enough in the design phase right now to where they are currently doing that and perhaps seeking feedback, just like what I'm giving here in this particular instance, by releasing this blog and then seeing what people have to say about it in the comments. So that's my take on it. I hope that dungeon scenarios can have just a little bit more thought to them. Perhaps between battles there's a bit of a card draw system. Perhaps there is a combination of treasure cards put into a sort of deck of other cards that represent traps or bad things that could happen, and RNG kind of tasks you with picking up the top card. Perhaps you have abilities that allow you to see what the top card is and move on to the next card, push your luck by skipping the first and go on to the second, and you have to accept the results of the second. Something like that, I think, would be very much more representative of a dungeon in Elden Ring. But if you disagree or you'd like to tack on to that, please comment down below. All commentary is always welcome. It is always read and always acknowledged, by me at least. Next, we have narrative scenarios. They represent a much more story-focused look at the world, choose your own adventure-style experiences to flesh out the world further, and present you with choices which can impact how other NPC characters interact with you moving forward. To give these scenario types some context, in the Limgrave set there are 22 scenarios in total. 8 of those are exploration scenarios, 6 are bosses, 5 are dungeons, and 3 are narrative. While the total number of scenarios varies across the boxes, the ratios of the scenario types within them are roughly the same. They gave the scenario types some context, but they didn't really explain anything about narrative scenarios, despite having a little paragraph there. I know nothing more about them than I did before I read this. So I wonder how the narrative scenarios work. If they are literally in text in the book and you choose your own adventure, or if there is some sort of tie-in to the exploration system. I'd like to know how this works very much. I'm very, very curious. But for all of you homebrewers out there, I think that these 4 scenario types give us some really good foundation on how we can separate the quests that we design into pieces that respect the player's time. If we have a hugely enormous difficult boss in the middle of a really difficult dungeon, that might be just superfluous. It might be something that's not necessary. You could have the exceedingly difficult dungeon as part 1, and as part 2 have the boss. And if you just have the boss, you can really ramp up the mechanics so that it's an experience that lasts a little bit longer, not because the boss is just a health sponge, something to hit over and over again like a punching bag as hard as you can, but perhaps additional mechanics in the room or the surrounding rooms that make fighting the boss a little bit easier or facilitate getting to the boss to begin with. All right, next we're going to cover quest types. There are 4 different quest types which appear within these scenarios, though some can only be completed in certain types of scenario. Now that makes sense. Let's see if these help the context of the above scenario types. Main quests are represented by Guidance of Grace cards. You must complete these quests to successfully finish a scenario. Every scenario will feature some main quests which will differ vastly depending on the scenario. I think that this is basically what we were seeing in the gameplay demo shown off by Steamforged Games. Side quests are the next type, and I think that these also were included in that demo. They are given out by NPCs you find during your adventure. These are quests which represent the tasks given to you by the other characters which populate the world. Side quests tend to be started during exploration scenarios, yes, but the variety of things you can be sent to complete means these can be completed across a variety of scenarios. Interesting. So once started, side quests will remain in play until completed, persisting through scenarios. As such, the current task you need to achieve will determine whether you can or cannot complete them during your current scenario. Very cleanly worded. I really like that. It kind of gives me the image of completing an exploration scenario and having picked up some side quests and then going into a dungeon scenario where you can complete the combat and get the loot at the end, still having that side quest and its completion being contingent on whether or not you can obtain that loot at the end. Perhaps you are aware that once you finish a particular dungeon, you'll get a specific material at the end that will allow you to complete your side quest. That's the sort of thing that I like seeing, and I think that this was a really clean and elegant way of doing it. And elegant is a word that I've used a lot with this game system so far, what they've shown off, with just very few minor exceptions. Next, class quests are quests which are specific to your tarnished character. Completing these will grant upgrades to your character's unique class trait. Class quests were covered in more detail in the July update. Check it out if you haven't already. Much like side quests, these persist through scenarios until completed. And finally, ghost quests. And this is one of those places where I'm a bit confused, where I hesitate just a little bit. Perfectly, again, cognizant that we're not getting a one-to-one from the video game, but there's no such thing as a ghost quest in the video game at all. So I kind of don't like seeing things just tacked on. This could be an interpretation of when you encounter certain ghosts in the game, and they kind of have a clue as to the lore of the game. They might be worshipping something that's not there. They might tell you something about the tree or about the area's boss. Other than lore or giving you a bit of a hint as to how to approach that boss when you get there, which you could find out by trial and error, they're not quests per se. There are also other ghosts that appear that kind of wander as soon as you find them. You'll find this sort of a hot spot, and you can do this over and over again until you get it right, but a ghost will appear walking away from you. If you lock on to kind of where that ghost is headed, you'll notice that it follows a bit of a pattern. There's a problem though. If you try to follow it directly, it disappears periodically and then reappears because it's still walking the same path. It's just not visible the entire time. You can go after this ghost and you can follow it until you get to a cave. More often than not, it's going to be a cave. Sometimes it's a dungeon. Sometimes it's a fully fleshed out area where you've got to do combat, avoid traps, fight a boss. Other times, it's just a really short treasure cache. You kind of bust through maybe an enemy, if there is one there, and perhaps a secret wall, and then you'll find the treasure. I don't think that these qualify as quests in the sense that they need to be included with an interpretation of the experience. But perhaps perhaps the game will change my mind. And perhaps that these are really, really short experiences, much like they are in the game, and they're only included for posterity. They barely count as a quest. Ghost quests are quests you find exclusively during exploration scenarios. Completing them allows players to filter through, scrying, for those familiar with the term, other decks of cards, which in turn helps with completing other quests more efficiently. The event and gathering decks are the main decks you'll be interacting with when completing ghost quests. Yeah, I hope it's a really short experience. Like the ghost says, you must explore exactly 3 tiles to the northwest in a straight line. And so you do so, regardless of what you find, combat, NPC, other encounter, you get through those 3 tiles, and that basically should complete the quest, in my opinion. And then you can scry through the cards, and then that would kind of correlate to learning the lore or sort of gaining the experience necessary to negotiate with a boss or find a cave a little bit faster than you would if you were doing it based solely on trial and error. So, and there we go, a quick blast to the overall structuring of the campaigns. I hope you've all enjoyed reading through, gaining some more context to the information given in prior game development updates, and I'm sure you're all entirely sick of seeing the words scenario and quest. Oh, Alex, I could never be sick of either of those words. Now I would like to go through some of the comments and see if anybody was confused about any of the points made here and some of the responses that would have been given by Steamforged. Noro asked, I'm a little confused. The 22 scenarios, are those the scenarios together for the boxes combined? Realm of the Grafted King, Weeping Peninsula expansion, Stormvale Castle expansion, Flying Dragon Naghiel expansion, and Erdtree Avatar, or only for the core box? And 2, so it's possible to jump straight to a boss fight if we want, or only after unlocking the boss through exploration or having the suitable quest for the boss? So 1 has a pretty explicit answer, actually. They did clarify that for Limgrave, there were 22 scenarios. And Limgrave is a specific set. It is a specific amount of cards and exploration tiles and so on. The other expansions that are mentioned by Noro in this question are separate. They have their own sets of tiles. The Weeping Peninsula is not in Limgrave. These are separate territories in the game and in the board game. So I would say that the 22 scenarios are just for Limgrave, as they stated, and Realm of the Grafted King would have its own set of scenarios. Weeping Peninsula would have its own set of scenarios. Stormvale Castle, its own set. Flying Dragon Naghiel, its own set. And I'm willing to bet that these huge boss expansions, Flying Dragon Naghiel and Erdtree Avatar, they probably have the boss scenarios, and then that should be a given, and probably not much in the way of other types of scenarios. I hope that they have like more than the one boss scenario for it, but it's possible that they have a little bit of exploration, since some of the places where you fight bosses are huge arenas. You could easily fight Flying Dragon Naghiel in an area that is almost the entire lake in Limgrave. There's a little ruined village that you could run through, and there are many enemies just in that little village, and you could never come across the dragon, or you could wake up and be engaged with the dragon, wake up the dragon, and retreat to this village and actually have the dragon attack you while you're all the way over in the village, because the fight is just so huge. The enemy is huge, the range of motion that it has is huge, its range is huge. So I could definitely see different types of scenarios included with these implied boss-only expansions. I think they'll do a good job categorizing what kinds of scenarios and quests need to be included with these huge boss expansions. So it's possible to jump straight to a boss fight if we want, or only after unlocking the boss through exploration. This was not answered by Steamforged Games, but I think that it's probably going to be 22 scenarios, one right after the other, basically in one campaign that covers the entirety of Limgrave. I'm willing to bet, because you don't have to start in Limgrave. You can start in the Weeping Peninsula. You don't have to start there. You could start pretty much wherever you want, but in terms of difficulty, you should start either in Limgrave, which would be true to the game starting point, or in the Weeping Peninsula, which would be true to the progression of difficulty. And you could, I would say, unlock the places you need to go at various points in each campaign. At some point, while adventuring through Limgrave, you will unlock a way to get to the Weeping Peninsula. At some point, you'll unlock a way to get to Caelid. I wonder how they're going to handle this in the board game, though. Like, will scenario 15 be the one that unlocks the Weeping Peninsula, but if you start the Weeping Peninsula, it'll be scenario 8. Will there be a sort of map of different scenarios that are interconnected in ways that force you into a sort of non-linear order so that you can tackle the path to get to the Erdtree at the end of the game, so that no two adventures are necessarily the same? Will they allow us to skip boss fights entirely except for... Sorry. Some of the stuff that I just talked about had spoiler stuff in it. I just realized while I was going through stuff, I'm gonna just edit that out. So continuing on with the questions. Steamforged Games has confirmed everything's going to be shipping in one wave, and there are no changes to the estimated delivery date at this time. Stretch pay is not an option for this project due to when it was opened on GameFound. Sadly, it is an investment. It is still an investment. Question from Robert here. This actually sounds like a good change all around. Good work. At Steamforged Games, Alex, will the exploration scenarios have some goals that will affect boss scenarios? And Alex responded with, not as I imagine you're thinking, but during exploration scenarios, you can stumble across crones, which, similarly to the stakes, you will gain a card when you interact with them. These cards can be cashed in to adjust boss fights, generally making them easier. The crones have replaced the merchant secrets, serving the same role, just removing a bit of the burden from merchants who already felt like were wearing too many hats when it came to the mechanics they were integral to. Not a fan of that choice myself. The crones are more like lore givers than anything in the game. The merchants literally do sell you documents that have secrets as to how to progress in certain scenarios, certain dungeons, or when fighting certain enemies or bosses. So interesting choice, definitely a choice. Though not being a negative Nancy here, it's just preference, just observation and preference. You've got yours, I've got mine. Norby asks, I'm okay with splitting up exploration and boss fights, but have you considered placing Marika's stakes as possible checkpoints other than Sites of Grace? SFG Alex responded, Stakes of Marika serve as something you discover as you explore. Once found, you gain a Stake of Marika card. These cards can be cashed in when you take on bosses. Each boss will have an amount of them you can attach to the scenario. They function as your continues should a member of the party die during the fight. That player would simply reset their dex tokens and place their miniature on the battlefield where they wish. This will consume one of your stakes. And once you're out of stakes, when the next player dies, the scenario would be failed. So a representation of the stakes of Marika is present and is one of the many ways we encourage players to really take their time during exploration scenarios to gather as many useful resources as they can. So that's about it for this video. I'm really happy and excited to have read this update in particular. It's always got a little bit of detail in there that if I'm really picking and criticizing something, I'll find a way to kind of draw that out just to make it a point to get it out of the way. And the rest of it is stuff I'm really happy about. I really trust that they're making good choices here, that they have a lot of good stuff despite having the monumental amount of work on their plate just with putting this game on paper to begin with. And I would absolutely encourage anybody who is interested in tackling a new, huge, multi-layered, sprawling dungeon crawler with very elegant gameplay to check out this campaign, give it a try, watch the early videos. Yes, I've been criticized before about referring to the old videos because I need to adjust my expectations and not rely on old footage. Old footage, I might add, that the company themselves had enough faith in to put forth as the overall forefront representation of how the gameplay flow works. And it's still there, so it's still relevant despite all of the minor changes that have been made to the rest of the auxiliary systems in the game system. Fluff off with that mentality. The video is there. It's worth watching and it's worth checking out if you want an accurate representation of how the game is to be played. At any rate, I'm still very excited to see this, and I hope that you can get excited with me too, if you aren't already. That's it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Comment anything you like down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and bye for now.